In this video, we will be replacing the spark plugs and ignition coils in this 2012 F-150. By opening the hood, we can gain access to the engine bay. We will be working in the centermost portion of the engine bay. By removing the engine cover, we will gain access to the area that we will be working on. However, we first need to remove our oil fill location cap. We can then pop the engine cover off and work that out. And then I'm going to recap that oil fill location. If I take a look at the passenger side portion of the engine, I can clearly see my 3 ignition coil locations. And then taking a look at the driver's side portion of the engine, I can not as clearly see those 3 ignition coil locations. Using some compressed air, we can clean off as much debris as we can so that we reduce the chance that something will fall inside the engine when we replace the spark plugs. Because we will be working on an electrical system component, we want to remove the negative battery terminal before we begin any work. And to do this, I am using a 5/16 combination wrench. And when removed, I like to wrap that cable end in a towel just to prevent it from accidentally hitting something. We can then take a look at our frontmost ignition coil. This is on the passenger side of the vehicle. We can see that there is a hold-down bolt holding that ignition coil in place. We can also see that there is a wiring harness that needs to be removed to remove the ignition coil. And because these are pretty dirty, I'm going to be using a little Amsoil metal protector to make sure things move as they should. Amsoil metal protector can be used as an electrical cleaner, so this is safe to use around these components. I'm also going to be using a flathead screwdriver to work those retaining clips back. And to remove these clips, we're first going to push the connector on all the way. We're going to press down on the small gray tab, and then we're going to wiggle off the connector. I'll apply a little additional Amsoil metal protector to that retaining bolt holding our ignition coil in place. And using an 8mm socket, I can remove that bolt. And with both of those connection points free, I can grab the ignition coil and work that straight out of the engine. And with that ignition coil removed, we can use a little compressed air with a compressed air gun that has a long nozzle, and we can clear any debris that may have fallen down inside the spark plug hole location. I'm then going to use a spark plug socket to remove this. This has a 5/8 inch end with a 3/8 inch drive. There is an extension with a swivel built into it. To start the replacement of this, I'm going to compare my old spark plug to my new spark plug just to make sure that they look about the same and there's no major differences or issues. Next, we need to check the spark plug gap. The repair manual states 0.035 inches for our gap. However, some of the research online indicates that that number has been revised to 0.028 inches. So we'll go ahead and gap these to 0.028. And we'll also be applying just a little bit of anti-seize to each of the spark plugs prior to installation. And when reinstalling the spark plugs, you want to ensure that you are starting it by hand first without the ratchet to reduce the chance that you cross-thread it. You should be able to get a bunch of turns before it starts to get difficult to turn. You should be able to use very light pressure. And if we pull the socket out, it should not be connected. And then we will finish up with a torque wrench, torquing this to 132 inch-pounds. And then we're going to compare our old ignition coil with our new ignition coil. Again, just to make sure that they basically look the same and there's no major differences. And then we'll be installing a little bit of dielectric grease into the end of the boot. Then we'll feed that ignition coil into the engine, lining up our bolt hole and our wiring harness location. Followed by our hold down bolt. Again, I am installing this by hand first to make sure I do not cross thread it. And we can finish that up by snugging that down. And lastly, we have that wiring harness. We should hear that click into place, and then we can close that secondary retainer clip. To recapitulate this process on our second location, we first want to apply some metal protector, release our wiring harness, press that on and depress the gray tab, wiggle that wiring harness free from the coil. We can then loosen our bolt holding our ignition coil in place and remove that bolt. That ignition coil should be free to be removed from the engine. We can work that around any lines that are in the way and slip that out. A little compressed air to clean out any debris. And then we can use our spark plug socket to remove the spark plug from the engine. Next, we want to gap our new spark plug and install anti-seize. This can then be reinstalled into the engine. Make sure you start this by hand first, and then we want to finish that up by torquing it down. After that, a little dielectric grease on our boot for our new ignition coil, and that can be installed in the proper orientation to our engine location. Reinstall that hold down bolt, again starting that by hand and finishing up with a ratchet. And lastly, reconnect our wiring harness and lock down that secondary tab. The only difference with the third ignition coil, this is on the passenger side, furthest from the front of the vehicle, closest to the firewall. You have to work the ratchet around some of the various lines and heater hoses. That is really the only difference with this last one that makes it a little bit more challenging. Everything else is the same. With our passenger side completed, Everything's looking pretty good over here. We're going to shift our focus to the driver's side. On our driver's side, our first coil located kind of behind that oil filler tube. After removing our wiring harness and that hold down screw, we run into our PCV line. We want to rotate our retaining clip and wiggle off that line. And taking just a little closer look at that clip, we have a small tab that gets rotated prior to wiggling that off. That then should give us the access we need to remove that ignition coil. And then the last two are located underneath an additional cover. We can work that off and gain access to those last two. There's nothing too challenging about the last two, aside from working in a little bit tighter area. We have one connection point we need to remove to access that furthest ignition coil. And for this one, we need to pinch the connector. The tab is on the bottom that we need to depress before we can wiggle that off. And from a little bit different angle, we can see that coming off, and our ignition coil can then be removed. And the last couple items are just to reconnect all of your connection points, double check that everything is secure, and reinstall any covers. Got our engine cover and oil filler tube cap. Then we have our battery, and we should be able to test it out. And everything sounds really good.